name is Jahnie De Villiers. I'm bringing you today a private sector perspective because I've been lucky enough in my career to be on both sides of the table when it comes to social dialogue. I spent over a decade of my career as a trade union official, so when my union comrades say recruitment is difficult, things are very, very hard, I understand that and I feel that and I've been there. And at the same time, I've also been a private sector representative since 2017 and then self-employed and Labour Amplified since 2020. Now, what I wanted to bring to your attention today, let's see if I can work this. There we go. This is very shortly, again, to just summarize the fundamental labour rights, to talk to you about collective bargaining and social dialogue, the workplace realities, the things that we actually work with on a daily basis, both as private sector representatives and as labour representatives, and a little bit on the future of work. Now, when it comes to the fundamental labour rights, you've heard it from the experts this morning, and these are the things that we want to focus on as far as it goes about freedom of association, effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. I happen to believe that collective bargaining is an absolute lifeblood, and I will elaborate on that. The elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labour, and the effective abolition of child labour. And I'm so happy to hear what the African Union is doing in this regard. It's very, very exciting work, and it's something that's unbelievably important to all of us. The elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Other pet subject is women's economic empowerment, so it's always wonderful to hear about initiatives in this regard, but also to see at the end of the day how they find practical application in the work that each and every one of us does on a daily basis. And then lastly, a safe and healthy working environment. Now, sorry, that's very, very small, but in South Africa, just to illustrate, there's an understanding of how these fundamental rights reinforce each other, and the way that our previous speaker illustrated so beautifully to say that decent work is not one or two or three or four, it's a sum of parts. At the end of the day, there needs to be integration. And now Section 23 of South Africa's Constitution provides very strong protection for fair labour practices. Now, again, this is wonderful, and what we see sometimes is that policy and law is progressive, and it gives us something that we need in our workplaces. But how does the actual practical implementation of this look? Now, in South Africa, we have the right to form employers' organizations as the private sector. You heard from Business Unity South Africa, which is the organization I also work very closely with. We also have the right to form trade unions and trade union federations. That is an unfettered right that nobody can interfere with. But now if we look at social dialogue, in South Africa, social dialogue is the absolute cornerstone of policy making. We do this at NEDLAC, which is the National Economic Development and Labour Council, very, very strong entity in South Africa, the place where we, for our sins, spend most of our days. And I must say, also the place where, when we were faced with the pandemic in South Africa, and we suddenly had to scramble to come together to make policy to, at the end of the day, protect the most vulnerable people in our society, everybody left what they were busy with, and we spent days on end, 7 days a week at NEDLAC. Now, South Africa also utilizes a tripartite plus structure, if anyone was not aware of that, where we include the community constituency in certain aspects that directly impact the community as well. So we have government, labour, employers, and then a community constituency as well. We've spoken about union membership. I think it's something that we need to spend a moment on, and I know our representative from South Africa mentioned this. Union membership in South Africa is declining. Union membership currently, with the latest figures that I could find, is around 23%. I don't think any employer should rub their hands together in glee when they see numbers like that. I think it's a real threat when we talk about social dialogue. We need strong employers' organizations, but we need strong representative unions. Now, just as an anecdote, when I spent my time in unions, for my sins, it was my responsibility to try and find out why people of my generation didn't want to join unions. Now, this is a real question, and I know that there are people younger than me in the room who also don't join unions. I saw numbers this morning from the United States that said people between 45 and 54 are the most likely age group to join unions. So while collective bargaining and the recognition of trade unions is very, very, very important. We also need to talk about union models and how unions can make themselves more appealing to different generations. If we look at Generation Z, when they come into our workplaces, if you're not on the phone, you don't exist. And that's the reality that all of us are faced with, unfortunately. So do think there is a little bit of work to do there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. I actually think that there is opportunity here. Because as our workforce becomes younger, we need products that appeal to that specific workforce. And it's important that young people also understand that being in a union affords them protection. It's just for me, it's a no-brainer, but probably because I spent a number of years within a union structure myself. Now, within workplaces themselves, they are changing rapidly. In South Africa, absolutely fueled by the pandemic, things changed. We went from going into offices to working online literally overnight and not being allowed out of the house. It was our reality. Now, in 2022, a survey showed that 2/3 of employees in South Africa are still splitting their time between the office and working from home. That's a massive number of employees in South Africa. So in other words, and the previous speaker highlighted this as well, which I was so thankful for, there's a challenge in terms of fundamental labor rights when you have people working from home. I almost want to say every single person in this room has felt that. When the pandemic hit, we suddenly worked 7 days a week. We barely slept. We were in meetings from 7 in the morning until 7 at night if we're lucky. And some of us were still homeschooling small children in between. There's no rest. And it becomes very, very difficult to maintain your productivity levels in a situation like that. So this is the kind of thing, unfortunately, where people work from home. How do you keep an eye on things like rest, compulsory rest periods? And of course, as well, how do unions access members when everybody is working online and from home? I believe that these questions should be explored with social partners because I do believe that hybrid working models are likely here to stay. When it comes to the future of work and workplaces are ever changing, and I think we all know that, but it needs a very agile social policy or policy environment, especially for labor policy. Social dialogue is key. It should be supported and funded appropriately, and just for the record, the private sector representative waited until the very last slide to talk about funding. But I think it's very, very important on a lighter note also that we take into consideration the work we do is expensive work. It needs to be prioritized and funded appropriately. I believe that decent work deficits happen in a communication and policy vacuum. I think it's very important that where there is change and change management, that it be done in a way that engages employees within a workplace, and that at the end of the day makes for better decision making as well. Best practices within the BRICS group, there are so many good practices coming out. If I can mention one, what the Brazilian representatives have mentioned around platform work and the way that they want to engage around platform work. I believe that's a best practice. And I believe that there is a lot more of that coming out from within this working group. And it should be shared and celebrated as well. So that, in short, thank you very, very much for your time. I do appreciate it.